The Once and Future Kane by Karl E. Wagner. It was early in 1960. The study hall monitor at Central High had given me a library pass. And Miss Venerable, too busy watching for turned-up collars and pulled-out shirt tails to assume I was doing any more than writing an English theme that afternoon. Any suspicion otherwise, and I probably would have landed in the detention hall alongside my best friend John Mayer, generally to be found there for drawing lurid scenes of horror and bloodshed, or reading books like The Broken Sword in English class. Luck was with me that day, and if the torchbearers of learning didn't notice me, I didn't see them either. I was watching death stalk through the forest idle, and the lines penciled across my notepaper began, "For miles uncounted, the forest stood supreme." The prose was a bit heavy, but I like it that way. It was a beginning. 11 years and some 100,000 words later, Bloodstone was finished, written and revised, discarded and taken up again, completed in fits and starts over the years. It was the first of more than a score of novels and short pieces I've written since those first few lines 15 years ago. My initial attempt was to set down on paper the doomed saga of a man who haunted my imagination. He was there with me that afternoon. I'd known him before then, come to know him further since, and while I know him as Kane, you might recognize him sooner if I spelled his name Kane. Kane. A name that has haunted mankind and mankind's legends since our oldest myths. Kane the rebel. Kane the killer. Kane who defied his creator. The name conjures images of violence and death. As with Satan, it is a name that inspires the dark side of man's imagination. Kane is known in legends outside his biblical presentation. Montague Summers tells us that traditionally Kane had red hair of a particular shade, was blue-eyed, and was left-handed. In literature, Kane has exerted a compelling fascination, even to authors of such stature as Coleridge and Byron. In more recent times, well-known fantasy authors have written of Kane. Among them, John Collier, mainly Wade Wellman, wrote a story about Kane years before his first story appeared in Weird Tales, and Robert E. Howard. Howard's poem, Flight, published posthumously in May 1971 issue of Witchcraft and Sorcery, describes Kane's flight from Eden. Till out of the ocean rose a shape, a monstrous thing of gloom, and his knees were loose, and the naked Kane cowered before his doom. "Come not to my red empire, Kane, there's blood upon your hand. The foremost killer of the earth comes not into my land. Down all the drifting years to come your fate mankind shall tell, that ye roamed the world for the rest of time, disowned by earth and hell. And the shape was gone, and the moon was red, and leaves stirred on the bough. Kane stood alone on the unknown sea, and a mark was on his brow." Somehow I doubted that Kane cowered. Still, I was interested to see, in reading this poem, a decade after I had begun to write about Kane, that Howard had felt much of the same fascination for this doomed outcast as did I, and that Howard, too, conceived of Kane as having been cursed to eternal wandering. Genesis is a bit vague on this, but then Genesis in its bias does not portray Kane in too favorable a light. Sort of like reading the official Olympian report on Prometheus. Mankind has sensed for millennia that there was more to Kane than the cloddish farmer of Genesis, envious and given to stealth and cowardness. Zeus doubtless said that Prometheus was a thief who unleashed a destructive force on gentle mankind and only got what he deserved. Coleridge and Byron understood this. I strongly feel this. I hope to make you understand this. Why then the spelling Kane instead of Cain? Primarily because I wanted to dissociate Kane from his biblical image. While Genesis does speak intriguingly of Cain's flight to the land of Nod, east of Eden, where he married and founded mankind's first city, Enoch, I wanted to break away from the popular picture of Cain, the disgruntled farmer, fumbling around Sunday school pageant costumes and deeing and dowing everything in sight. As Cain, he is not locked into the popular conception of biblical characters in biblical times. Besides, it makes for a fine jolt to the reader the first time it hits him. Wow, then this Kane must be that. There are, I suppose, sentimental reasons for the spelling as well. For one thing, a sympathy for Buck Rogers' nemesis, Killer Kane. or fascination with Orson Welles' gigantic Charles Foster Kane, towering through Citizen Kane. For that matter, the work of another genius of film, Roger Corman, was responsible for my first conception of Kane as a character. In 1956, I saw Gunslinger, in which John Ireland played a hero-villain gunslinger named Kane, or so I assumed it was spelled at the time with a K. Imagine Shane, aha, with Alan Ladd and Jack Palance combined into the same character. I doubt anyone other than a rabid Corman freak remembers Gunslinger, but I thought it was the greatest thing I've seen since Johnny Guitar and until Ride the High Country. I rewrote the film's obviously trumped-up ending in my mind 1,000 times. It's rather a fascination to me, perhaps because I'm sensitized to it, to note just how many times the name Kane does appear in pulp literature. It's a fine name, either first or last, and one more commonly bestowed upon villains that pops up in pulp yarns time and time again, seemingly far more so than random name selection will allow. Sometimes the name is that of the hero. Kane Lanark of Manly Wade Wellman's eerie short novel Fearful Rock. Jim Kane in E. Hoffman Price's popular Datu Ryan series in Adventure. Michael Caine in Michael Moorcock's Edward P. Bradbury Mars trilogy. I recall a President Kane from one pulp thriller, and more recently, a Western paperback entitled simply Kane. Obviously, spelled Kane or Kane, the name is pronounced the same way, and carries the same mystique. We are dealing with phonetics that antedate the English alphabet after all. Having had to deal with fanatics all my life who insist on spelling Karl as Karl, I'm certain Kane actually spells his name Kane, but hasn't a chance against the hordes who jot it down Kane. Most noteworthy by far of the fantasy genre Kanes is Robert E. Howard's demon-driven Puritan, Solomon Kane. I first encountered Solomon Kane about 1962, when I had a great good luck to buy a copy of Skullface and Others from Stephen Takacs, who was then breaking up his personal collection. I was astonished to see that Howard, too, has sensed the mystique of that name. The more impressed, because I had decided that Howard was without equal in the epic fantasy genre. By that time I had begun half a dozen Kane tales, even completed one novelette, The Treasure of Lynortus, eventually published in Midnight Sun #1 as Lynortus Reprise, that was out collecting rejections from fantasy and science fiction and fantastic. John Mayer, who was illustrating my Kane stories whenever he could spare time from his 90-page comic strip format fantasy epic Armageddon, was my comrade and confidant, being the only other one of Central High's 4 or 5 science fiction fantasy fans who had the physical presence to admit openly to reading books that were not assigned for the class. Mayer agreed it was a strange coincidence, possibly ordained by certain dark forces, but not an affront to Howard's memory. Kane was, after all, not an uncommon name. My Kane was, after all, Kane, and Howard Solomon Kane was a dour Puritan adventurer of the 16th century. Besides being separated by a staggering break of time, the two characters in no way resemble one another, not physically and certainly not in temperament. Solomon Kane is obsessed with concepts of good and evil, right and wrong. Kane is amoral. But patently, Kane and Solomon Kane have no more in common than, say, Solomon Kane and Charles Foster Kane. More to the point, Kane is Kane/Kane. I couldn't change his name to Ralph any more than the author of Sherlock Holmes can be called Sir Arthur Ralph Doyle. Growing up in the 50s was a bummer, and not many ever survived it. The 50s was sort of like 10 years in detention hall, and the current 50s nostalgia fad made me puke. While the witch hunts had everyone on alert for commies hidden under the rug, a mob of Sunday school teachers led by a quack were out purging the comic book stands. A noble crusade which immediately wiped crime and juvenile delinquency from the face of the earth for all time. Or has violence on TV been responsible for creating the crime? I'm certain there was no violence and crime before comic books and TV. And while the comics were being purged, the pulps were dropping off one by one. The only bright spot was that the paperbacks decided it was acceptable to publish science fiction fantasy material on a regular basis. Until I graduated from college, I didn't know more than a handful of people in my age group who have ever heard of Robert E. Howard or H.P. Lovecraft. Older fans, of course, but until the paperback revival of those two authors in the mid-60s, this was damn esoteric stuff. I had been lucky enough to get Avon's Cry Horror H.P. Lovecraft collection when it came out, and later World's Best Supernatural Stories turned up in a dingy bookstore. But none of the area libraries had the gnome press Conans, and it wasn't until I bought Skullface that I had a good look at Howard. Otherwise, for H.P. Lovecraft, Robert E. Howard, and many of the other fantasy greats who are now easily accessible, the only way to read them was to chance upon them in a general fantasy anthology. Or you could go back and try to obtain the pulps. In the late 50s, I decided I needed a complete set of weird tales, among other things. Fortunately, investors hadn't driven the price of pulps out of reach, and through Jerry Delarue and others, I was able to buy copies back through the early 30s just by scavenging Coke bottles, going without lunch, or whatever. Early on, I sold my coin collection to buy sets of Avon Fantasy Reader, fantastic novels, and a few other essentials that gave me a good dose of otherwise unavailable fantasy classics. Thus, I have read Howard and Ace's The Macabre Reader, which included The Cairn on the Headland. Next, I got my hands on the June 1935 Weird Tales and read the second half of Beyond the Black River. Mighty fine. I was delighted to snatch up the February-March 1953 fantasy magazine from a used book dealer and read The Black Stranger. I was hooked on Howard, but good, and avidly ferreted out stories whenever I could find them. I still do. With any modern epic fantasy character, the question immediately comes up, how much does the author owe to or imitate Robert E. Howard? A fair question. Howard's work dominates the field, both in popularity and in terms of excellence. It's impossible for a modern epic fantasy author not to be aware of Howard, and a good many modern writers are consciously and admittedly imitative of Howard. So what about Kane in this regard? As should be obvious to anyone who's ever read a Kane story, Kane is not a copy of Conan. And while I cannot deny my profound admiration for Howard, I do not consider my writing to be an imitation of Howard. That I have been influenced by Howard is unavoidable. Over the years, I've read most every scrap he's written, and I consider his best stories to be among the best fantasy stories ever written, against all comers and subgenre damned. Certainly, if I've never read a thing at all by Robert E. Howard, my own writing would be somewhat altered, equally certain, altered on the deficit side. But I would still have written about Kane, and Kane and his world was still substantially the same, because Howard was not my model with Kane. On the contrary, as I pointed out in a rambling sort of way, I was developing Kane in the 50s, began writing the Kane saga in 1960, before I ever encountered Robert E. Howard. It was Mayer who, in reading the opening of Bloodstone, recommended that I try to find a used copy of Fantasy Magazine with The Black Stranger, or better yet, invest 59 cents in a copy of The Broken Sword from the remainder table at the Gateway. I recall that Lovecraft used a similar argument when later fans pointed out that many similarities of his early writing and Lord Dunsany stories, probably with equal success. Lovecraft maintained that early tales such as The White Ship was written before he had ever heard of Dunsany, and that the similarities existed because he and Dunsany shared many of the same literary and philosophical ideas. I always thought that sounded fishy, but maybe it was true. H.P. Lovecraft's Dunsany-like tales were closer to Dunsany than any subsequent pastiche consciously imitative of Dunsany. Could be their heads were in the same place at one time. So to conclude this tangent before the argument degenerates into who the hell cares, I think there are similarities between Howard's writing and my own that occur because, based on what I've read about Howard and read into his work, Howard and I share certain ideas in our philosophy of writing and of life. Conan's grim, and I think accurate, prediction of civilization's defeat in the war it wages with barbarianism at the close of Beyond the Black River is comparable to Kane's nihilistic philosophy that chaos is a kinetic force that must wage eternal war with the stagnant principle of order. Howard and I both have a pessimistic, violent concept of existence as a hostile universe in which man is but a chance and inconsequential phenomenon significant only in his own eyes. Lovecraft felt this too, of course. Lovecraft saw mankind as completely at the mercy of forces beyond his comprehension. Howard felt that certain rare individuals, Karl, Conan, Solomon Kane, might for a time brandish a red blade of defiance. Kane carries defiance further to the state of outright rebellion, a guerrilla warfare against the gods. Howard takes great care to develop mood and atmosphere in his best stories, and in so doing makes the reader feel the dark, desperate undercurrent of his character's schemes and struggles. It is in this that I feel closest to Howard, and it is something that his conscious imitators have never captured. The disparity of writing quality aside, the mood immediately sets Pastiche Howard apart from the real article. Pseudo Conan is out having the best time, because he's the biggest, toughest, mightiest suit barbarian on the block, and he's going to have a swell time of brawling and chopping monsters and rescuing princesses and offing wizards and drinking and brawling and etc., etc. But in Howard's fiction, the underlying black mood of pessimism is always there. And even Conan, who enjoys a binge or a good fight, is not having a good time of it at all. This is particularly true of Solomon Kane and King Cole, driven men from whom not even a desperate battle can exercise their black mood, while Conan at times can find brief surcease in excesses of pleasure and violence. I think Solomon Kane and King Cole were closer to Howard's true mood, while Conan represented the ability to escape briefly from the black reality that Howard wished he could emulate. He failed. Of all Howard's characters, I most prefer King Cole, and it is Cole who is closest to my own Kane. What then were the major influences of Kane? When I first began to read, the books I most enjoyed were collections of classical and Nordic mythology. Those gods and goddesses were a tough lot, all right, but I found myself pulling for the opposition in every battle. And Lucifer. Well, there's a rematch of that one, and this time Kane evens the score. In 1956, along with seeing Gunslinger, I first read Dracula. And I realized there was a damn sight more to the count than Lugosi's inept and lisping continental ladykiller. Not long afterward, I discovered Fu Manchu. Things began to crystallize. 1. For every 50 people who've heard of Dracula, only one can identify Jonathan Harker. For every 100 people who have heard of Fu Manchu, only one can name his nemesis. 2. In the movies and books, no matter how scary it got, you knew the guys in the white hats had to pull it off because good always conquered evil. 3. The only interesting figure in all this stuff was the villain, because he was a guy with the brains, power, and initiative. The villain did things. The hero just wandered into and out of enough traps and tight places to stretch out the action until the inevitable confrontation at the end when the villain would bite the dust or pitch over the waterfall. Hell. It didn't take much to see that that wasn't just bad art. It was just too far from reality. Several things happened at the close of the 50s and the beginning of the 60s, not the least of which was the disappearance of the Eisenhower-Nixon intellectual mood. I have read enough modern, fine literature to be familiar with the anti-hero. He was even more inept than the old-style hero. He couldn't do anything right. But I discovered in quick succession Dorian Gray in Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, Lord Grow in the Worm Boris, Jurgen in Cabell's Jurgen, Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, and a Gothic novel. The first group of books showed me just what could be done with a completely amoral character, carefully and sympathetically developed. And the Gothic novel introduced me to the hero-villain. Let me stress, in case anyone reading this far isn't already aware of it, that the Gothic novel has absolutely nothing to do with the eternally popular and inevitably insipid Gothics that housewives, I'm told they're the culprits, devour while under the hairdryer. No more so than nurse romances have anything to do with medical textbooks. The English Gothic novel was a late 18th and early 19th century phenomenon, part of a general rebirth of interest in the Gothic culture, as it was then interpreted, in much the same way as the slightly later German Romanticist literature, which I also got into a little later, was part of the Romanticist rebellion against the rigidity of classicism. Heavy stuff. If you haven't encountered the real thing, Gothic novels are generally multiple volume things in which the heroine of considerable purity is forever threatened by haunted castles, shadowy presences, and debauch and or sinister counts and or bandits. The hero is usually pretty distant, and in general out of things until the end, if he ever comes through at all. Lots of yearning and swooning, but what I really liked out of the Gothic novel was the careful, indeed obsessive attention to mood and atmosphere. Action was frequently at a standstill, if not slower. But those haunted castles and ruined abbeys and desolate mountains and gloomy moors and pages of them, chapters. And then there was a major character of the Gothic novel, the hero/villain. In him I saw what I wanted. He was the central character, not just a viewpoint character, but the dynamic force who carried the entire novel. Evil? Yes, but majestic, powerful, a brooding, haunted figure, doomed and damned but not about to call it quits, and he was amoral. When he acted, no consideration of good or evil entered into his judgment. The hero-villain did as he pleased, acted according to his own interests and desires. If he was a monster, he was a magnificent monster. If he failed, well, he didn't die in bed. I eagerly read through the Standard Four, The Castle of Otranto by Wapple, The Mystery of Udolpho by Radcliffe, The Monk by Lewis, and, greatest of the entire school, Melmoth the Wanderer by Maturin. If I had to pick the book that shaped Kane into the character he is, it would have to be Melmoth the Wanderer. Melmoth, a doomed wanderer who trails catastrophe and misfortune in his footsteps, immortal so long as he can find another soul to sacrifice itself willingly for his sake. I don't know how Kane would have taken shape without Melmoth, but it would be a different character today if I hadn't read Maturin. Lord knows there have been innumerable other authors and books that have influenced me, or at least made an impression that lasted far longer than the time spent reading the book. Writings I've greatly admired, things I've read and wondered why I couldn't write anything that good, tried to analyze just what the author was doing to create this or that effect. I mostly mentioned material that impressed me during the early years of writing about Kane. There's a great deal more. Anderson's The Broken Sword impressed me when it first came out. I still hold it as one of my 2 or 3 favorite novels. C.L. Moore's Drill and Northwest Smith stories are as good as anything the genre has ever seen, to my mind. A. Merritt is a writer whose books I still reread with great admiration. Robert W. Chambers, when he decides to evoke a mood of horror, exceeds even Lovecraft. Few writers can make horror more uncomfortably convincing than Manly Wade Wellman. There are many other books and writers, but I don't mean to make this a top 20 list. The point is, these writers whose works has left a lasting impression on me, as has Robert E. Howard, although their writing is quite different. I suppose if I had to characterize my own approach and orientation, I say I'm more of a horror writer than an action writer. That is, I prefer to build up a particular atmosphere or mood and play with that, rather than stress headlong adventure. If that sounds out of place in a subgenre that some call sword and sorcery, it's because I think there's more to epic fantasy, as I prefer to call it, than thrill-of-the-minute battles, captures, and escapes. While some writers insist that the brawny barbarian, beautiful princess, evil wizard cliches are all the genre can or should ever be, I take adamant exception. There was a similar argument put forward years back by similar great minds who maintain that science fiction could and should never progress beyond the scope of square-jawed rocketeers, bikini space-suited scientists' daughters, and bug-eyed monsters with over-eager tentacles. Those who dismiss epic fantasy as sword and sorcery crap are the same class as those who scorn space opera nonsense. Kane, at any rate, is an attempt to introduce a few new angles into the genre, a blend of traditional elements and motives with some other newer concepts. At times I tried to merge Gothic concepts of horror with psychological terror. About 1965, acid and the rest of the psychomimetics became generally available, and somehow I began to understand just how much a merger of Gothic and psychological ought to be carried off. I called the result acid Gothic, which my friends thought was an interesting concept. Publishers have been slower to show much enthusiasm, probably because they know this genre is supposed to concentrate on lots and lots of action, not atmospheric head numbers. They proved this with the first published Kane book, Darkness Weaves, written in the mid-60s and released in early 1970. The novel was a lot closer to the epic fantasy scheme than most Kane material, and thus seemed to have some publishable merit. Powell Publications corrected for my lamentable lack of headlong action by chopping the novel from 70,000 to 50,000 words and adding lots of exclamation points. Things moved right along after that, though I was unappreciative, being puzzled as to why they have rewritten the description of Kane in addition to other enormities. Answer: so Kane would look like the character on the cover, whoever he was. The world, or PAL to be sure, just wasn't ready for acid Gothic. Death Angel's Shadow, bought by Paperback Library soon after, fared much better, though WPL, Warner Brothers now having bought the outfit, sat on the thing until June 1973. WPL also thought they could help move the action along by adding lots of exclamation points, and some meddling ads didn't like my English spelling and adding lots of apostrophe S's endings to possessives already ending in S. Not really a setback for acid Gothic though. Even if WPL found out at the last minute they could not reproduce the John Mayer interior art they already paid for. But they gave him credit for the unpublished art just the same, which Powell didn't when they did publish his art. This is a very strange business, this writing. Death Angel's Shadow was another book written in the 1960s. It was closer to what I was trying to achieve than Darkness Weaves. Bloodstone, completed in 1971, is closer still. Closest of the completed novels. I'm happiest with the series of stories collected under the title Night Winds, Pure Acid Gothic. Maybe someday a publisher will bite. In the Lair of Yisel, which is being reprinted in a British collection this spring, is a good example of what I'm talking about. Probably the most noticeable thing about the Kane series, if you haven't run into it before, is the dialogue. John Mayers did the same thing 35 years ago, also to the confusion of many readers. Dialogue is treated as a free translation into modern idiom, vernacular, measurements, what have you. The words are intended to sound to you, the reader, as they would have sounded to a listener at the same time. This bothers a lot of people somehow. I mean, obviously I can't reproduce the exact words. No typeface exists for the characters, and phonetic English equivalents, as can be done in a crude way, say, with Chinese, would be meaningless to anyone but Kane or myself. Obviously, translation is necessary, right? For some reason, there seems to be a grand tradition that this means translating into overblown pseudo-Elizabethan dialogue. Lots of absurd disclaiming like balloons in Marvel store comics. Well, there are places where the New English Bible is rejected because Jesus, as we all know, spoke English a la King James, and to hell with accuracy of translation. My own thinking is that a good translation must translate meaning and effect from point A to point B. No one in the distant past thought at this time that he was speaking in any way other than the current mode. How'd you like to have your barroom conversation translated 3,000 years from now in terms of these and thous? Let's take an example. Foot soldiers are notoriously an uncouth lot. Now here's Sergeant Crunk, slogging around a hot jungle back in Kane's heyday. Guy up front lets a branch fly in his face. Got it? Okay, Crunk says an obscenity, which may be phonetically rendered as racklat. Now that doesn't translate to forsooth, does it? And he didn't shout feces either, did he? Plainly, the jungle echoed the howl of shit. At least that's what it sounded like to them. And to us. And this is another one of those things that give publishers pause. So what's all this leading up to? With Kane, I want to put you in a world distant from armpit spray ads and inflation economics double talk. I want it to be an intriguing, if frightening world, and I want it to seem real to you. I want the characters to seem real, to behave in a believable manner. When they speak, the words will be the words you might have spoken in their place. I want you to see the world and know the people. And then, you and I are going on a little trip with Kane. Maybe you've already been to some of the places, know some of the people. But this time, you're with Kane.